Dylan Rivera was a 17-year-old high school senior living in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. He had grown up in the same small town his entire life, where everyone knew each other's name but little more. His days were a familiar rhythm of school, part-time work at a local diner, and helping his mother with his younger siblings. The family had struggled since his father passed away when Dylan was 10, but they found ways to make ends meet, even if it meant Dylan often went without things most kids took for granted. One Saturday afternoon, Dylan was riding his bike home from his job. The late autumn sun cast golden light across the streets, and the crisp air hinted at the coming winter. He had just turned down Maple Avenue when he noticed a frail woman standing on the corner. She was dressed in a light sweater far too thin for the chilly weather, and her white hair seemed to glow in the sun. She looked lost. Dylan slowed his bike, the training his mother had instilled in him about helping others urging him to stop. He approached her cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Excuse me, Ma," he said softly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman turned to face him, her blue eyes watery and confused. She clutched a small handbag to her chest. I can't seem to find my way home," she said, her voice trembling. "I know it's nearby, but I can't remember where." Dylan's heart sank. He had heard of Alzheimer's before and recognized the signs. The woman looked vulnerable, and the idea of her wandering the streets alone unsettled him. "Do you have an address or a phone number I could call?" he asked gently. The woman frowned, opening her bag and rifling through it with shaking hands. After a moment, she pulled out a small scrap of paper with an address written on it in tidy cursive. Dylan glanced at it. The address was on the other side of town, at least a few miles away. "Okay," he said with a reassuring smile. "I'll help you get home. It's a bit far to walk, though. Do you mind waiting while I call someone?" She nodded, and Dylan pulled out his phone. But after dialing his mom and a couple of friends, it became clear that no one was available to help. He looked at his bike, then back at the woman. "All right, I've got an idea," he said. "It's not fancy, but it'll work. Are you okay with riding on the back of my bike?" The woman hesitated but eventually nodded, her trust in the boy evident. Dylan helped her onto the small rack over the back wheel, careful to keep her steady. Once she was seated, he began pedaling toward her address, determined to see her home safely. The ride was slow, with Dylan carefully navigating the streets while trying to keep the woman comfortable. As they traveled, she shared fragmented memories of her youth, her family, and her love for gardening. Dylan listened patiently, responding with kind words that seemed to soothe her. When they finally arrived at the address, Dylan's legs burned from the effort, but relief washed over him as he saw the large, well-kept house that matched the description the woman had provided during their ride. It was far grander than anything he had ever seen up close, with a sprawling yard and elegant windows. Dylan helped her off the bike and walked her to the door. Before he could knock, it swung open to reveal a frantic-looking man in his 40s. His expression shifted from worry to overwhelming relief as he spotted the elderly woman. "Mom." "Oh, thank goodness," the man said, rushing forward to embrace her. He looked at Dylan with gratitude. "Did you bring her here?" "Yes, Sir," Dylan said, feeling awkward under the man's gaze. "She was lost, and I wanted to make sure she got home safely." The man nodded, his eyes glistening. "You have no idea what this means to us. We've been looking for her everywhere. Thank you so much." Dylan waved it off, muttering, "It was nothing." But as he prepared to leave, he couldn't help but feel a warmth spread through him. He had done something good, and though he didn't expect anything in return, the man's heartfelt gratitude made the effort worthwhile. As he pedaled home, he didn't notice the man watching him from the doorway, a look of contemplation crossing his face. The next morning, Dylan woke up to the sound of his younger siblings arguing over the last pancake in the kitchen. Rubbing his eyes, he glanced at the clock and realized he had overslept, a rare occurrence for someone so accustomed to early mornings. He stretched and got dressed quickly, intending to help his mother with the weekend chores. His legs were sore from the long bike ride the day before, but the memory of the elderly woman's grateful smile made the ache feel worthwhile. After breakfast, Dylan decided to head outside to patch up an old basketball hoop for his little brother. As he worked, a sleek black car pulled up in front of their modest home. It was the kind of car Dylan had only ever seen in movies or parked outside the fancy hotel downtown. A tall man in a sharp suit stepped out. It took Dylan a moment to recognize him. It was the same man who had opened the door to greet the elderly woman. "Dylan Rivera," the man called, his voice warm but firm. Dylan stood, suddenly self-conscious in his worn jeans and faded hoodie. Yes, that's me." The man approached with an easy smile, extending his hand. "I'm Matthew Harper. We met yesterday. You helped my mother, Margaret, find her way home." "Oh, right," Dylan said, shaking his hand awkwardly. "I'm glad she's okay." Matthew nodded, his expression sincere. "She's doing much better now, thanks to you. I can't tell you how much that means to our family." Dylan shrugged, feeling the familiar urge to downplay his actions. Anyone would have done the same thing. "I'm not so sure about that," Matthew said thoughtfully. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "We wanted to show our gratitude. Please take this." Dylan frowned, hesitating. "I didn't do it for money, sir." "It's not just money," Matthew said gently. "It's an acknowledgement of your kindness. People like you remind us there's still good in the world. Please consider it a thank you from our family." Dylan reluctantly accepted the envelope, his curiosity piqued. Matthew handed him a business card as well. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out," he said before returning to his car and driving away. Dylan stood there for a moment, stunned. He opened the envelope to find a handwritten note from Margaret, thanking him for his kindness, alongside a crisp $100 bill. For Dylan, who often counted loose change to help his mother buy groceries, it felt like a small fortune. That evening, he told his mom about the encounter. She listened carefully, her expression a mix of pride and caution. "It's a blessing, Dylan," she said. "But remember, the real reward is knowing you did something good for someone who needed help." Dylan nodded, tucking the money away in an old jar he kept for emergencies. He thought about Margaret and her gentle smile, the way she had trusted him without hesitation. The memory filled him with a quiet sense of fulfillment. A few days later, life returned to its usual routine, and Dylan assumed the encounter was behind him. But the Harpers hadn't forgotten him. Late one afternoon, as Dylan finished his shift at the diner, a young woman with bright green eyes and a confident stride approached him. She was dressed casually, but there was an air of elegance about her that immediately set her apart. "Are you Dylan Rivera?" she asked, her voice cheerful. "That depends," Dylan said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Who's asking?" She grinned. "I'm Emily Harper, Margaret's granddaughter. My dad told me all about you." Dylan blinked in surprise. "Oh, nice to meet you." "Likewise," Emily said. "Listen, my grandmother can't stop talking about you. She insists on meeting you again. Would you mind coming by the house sometime?" Dylan hesitated. He wasn't used to stepping into unfamiliar worlds, especially ones as different from his own as the Harper family seemed to be. But something about Emily's genuine smile and the thought of seeing Margaret again made him agree. "Sure," he said finally. "I can stop by after work tomorrow." "Perfect," Emily said. "We'll see you then." As she walked away, Dylan couldn't help but wonder what he was getting himself into. Part of him felt out of place, but another part, the part that remembered Margaret's grateful eyes, told him this was the start of something bigger than he could have imagined. The next day, Dylan was nervous as he rode his bike to the Harper residence after his shift at the diner. His uniform was still faintly stained with ketchup, and he had done his best to clean it before arriving. The thought of walking into their grand house in his secondhand clothes filled him with unease. But he reminded himself that Margaret didn't seem like the type to judge him. When he reached the house, the gates were already open, and he pedaled up the long driveway, marveling again at the size of the property. The sprawling gardens looked as though they had been painted, with perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds bursting with color. Emily greeted him at the door, her smile as bright as before. She had changed into a casual sweater and jeans, making Dylan feel a little less out of place. "You made it," she said warmly. "Come on in." As Dylan stepped into the foyer, the sheer elegance of the house took his breath away. Polished wood floors gleamed beneath chandeliers, and sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating walls lined with family photos and artwork. It was nothing like the small, cramped home he shared with his family. Margaret was waiting for him in the sitting room, her face lighting up the moment he entered. "Dylan," she said, her voice brimming with warmth. "It's so good to see you again." He approached her with a grin. "It's good to see you too, Mrs. Harper. How have you been?" She reached out to hold his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Much better, thanks to you. I still get a little confused sometimes, but it's comforting to be home." They talked for a while, Margaret recounting old stories about her childhood, her love for classical music, and her garden. Dylan listened attentively, drawn in by her gentle spirit. He noticed how her confusion seemed to melt away when she talked about things she loved. Emily soon joined the conversation, bringing them glasses of lemonade and snacks. She teased Dylan about his work at the diner but did so with a friendliness that put him at ease. After an hour, Margaret excused herself to rest, leaving Dylan and Emily alone. "You really made an impression on her," Emily said, leaning back in her chair. "I haven't seen her this happy in months." Dylan shrugged, feeling the familiar urge to deflect compliments. "She's a sweet lady. Anyone would have helped." "Maybe," Emily said thoughtfully. "But not everyone would have gone as far as you did. Most people would have called the police or driven by without stopping." Dylan shifted uncomfortably. It just felt like the right thing to do. Emily studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You're different, you know. In a good way." Dylan didn't know how to respond to that, so he changed the subject. "So your dad said your family's been looking after her for a while." Emily nodded. "She's been living with us ever since her diagnosis. It's been hard, but we're lucky we have the resources to give her the care she needs." Her expression softened. "Not everyone gets that." Dylan thought about his own family's struggles. How even a small medical bill could throw their finances into chaos. He admired the Harpers' ability to care for Margaret, but it also reminded him of the stark contrast between their lives. Before he left, Emily walked him to the door. "Thanks for coming," she said. "It really means a lot to her and to us." "No problem," Dylan replied, feeling a sense of gratitude for the kindness he had been shown as well. As he rode home, his mind swirled with thoughts. He had never imagined his life intersecting with people like the Harpers, yet here he was, drawn into their world. It felt strange but also uplifting, like he was part of something meaningful. The following weeks brought more invitations from the Harpers. Dylan found himself spending more time at their home, helping Margaret with small projects in the garden or simply keeping her company. He learned that her love for flowers was matched only by her passion for baking, and she delighted in teaching him how to make pies and cookies. Emily often joined them, her quick wit and easy laugh making Dylan feel like he belonged. Their bond grew naturally, built on shared stories and quiet moments of understanding. One afternoon, as Dylan helped Margaret prune her rose bushes, Matthew approached him with a thoughtful expression. "Dylan, can I have a word?" "Of course," Dylan said, brushing dirt off his hands. Matthew led him to a quiet spot in the garden. "You've been spending a lot of time here, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. You've brought so much joy to my mother, and I'd like to do something for you in return." Dylan's first instinct was to protest, but Matthew held up a hand. "Hear me out. I understand you work a lot to support your family. "If you're interested, I'd like to offer you a part-time job here. It's nothing glamorous, but we could use someone to help with the garden and run errands, and it would pay more than your current job." Dylan was stunned. The offer was generous, and the thought of earning more money for his family was tempting. But what surprised him most was the way Matthew spoke to him not as a charity case, but as someone valued for their character and hard work. "I'll think about it," Dylan said finally, his voice steady. As he left that day, his thoughts were a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. The Harpers had already given him so much, and now they were offering more. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than money. It was about the connections he was building and the unexpected doors opening in his life. Dylan accepted Matthew's offer. It wasn't an easy decision. He felt a nagging fear that taking the job might seem like he was exploiting the Harper family's generosity. But after talking it over with his mother, who reassured him it was an opportunity he had earned, he decided to go for it. His first day on the job was a quiet one. Margaret was delighted to see him in an official capacity, and Emily teased him about his promotion from Good Samaritan to garden hand. Dylan threw himself into the work with the same diligence he brought to everything he did, pruning hedges, weeding flower beds, and carrying pots of soil across the sprawling yard. Though the physical labor was hard, it felt different from his job at the diner. Here, he wasn't just clocking hours for a paycheck. He was helping a family who had welcomed him into their lives, and the sense of purpose that gave him made every ache worthwhile. In the weeks that followed, Dylan became a familiar presence at the Harper estate. He spent mornings in the garden with Margaret, her sharp humor and storytelling making the hours fly by. She often spoke about her late husband, who had built the garden for her as a wedding gift, and Dylan could see how much it meant to her to keep it thriving. Afternoons were usually spent running errands with Emily, whose light-hearted banter kept Dylan on his toes. They visited nurseries for new plants, picked up supplies for Margaret's baking experiments, and occasionally stopped for coffee when Emily insisted they needed a break. Though Dylan still worked a few shifts at the diner to help his mom, the extra income from the Harper job eased their financial strain. He was able to buy new shoes for his siblings and surprise his mom with a little extra for groceries, something that made him feel an immense sense of pride. One sunny Saturday, the Harpers invited Dylan and his family to a barbecue at their home. Dylan was hesitant. At first his siblings could be a handful, and he worried about how they'd feel stepping into such a different world. But Emily and Matthew insisted, assuring him that everyone would be welcome. When Dylan's family arrived, the Harpers went out of their way to make them feel comfortable. Emily showed Dylan's younger siblings around the garden, where they squealed with delight at the koi pond and tried to climb the apple tree. Margaret chatted warmly with Dylan's mom, complimenting her on raising such a kind and hardworking son. Dylan felt a mix of emotions as he watched his family laughing and enjoying themselves. He had always been fiercely protective of them, shouldering more responsibility than most kids his age. Seeing them so happy in this moment filled him with gratitude. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the garden lights came on, Margaret pulled Dylan aside. She was holding a small box wrapped in simple paper. "I wanted you to have this," she said, pressing it into his hands. Dylan opened the box to find an antique pocket watch, its surface engraved with delicate floral patterns. "This belonged to my husband," Margaret explained. "He carried it with him every day, and it's always reminded me of his strength and kindness. You've shown me those same qualities, Dylan. You're part of this family now, whether you realize it or not." Dylan was stunned. "Mrs. Harper, I can't accept this. It's too important." "Nonsense," she said firmly. "Things like this are meant to be shared, not locked away. And I know he'd be proud for you to have it." Tears pricked Dylan's eyes as he accepted the watch, the weight of it in his palm feeling heavier than it should. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll take good care of it." That night, as Dylan lay in bed, the watch resting on his nightstand, he thought about how much had changed in just a few months. He had stepped into a world so different from his own and found not just kindness, but connection and opportunity. But more than anything, he felt a profound sense of gratitude not for the gifts or the money, but for the relationships he had built. The Harpers had taught him that kindness wasn't just something you gave, it was something that could grow and ripple outward, creating a bond that bridged even the widest gaps. And for the first time in a long while, Dylan felt truly hopeful about what the future might hold. A year had passed since Dylan first encountered Margaret on that chilly autumn day, and life had changed for both him and the Harpers. Margaret's Alzheimer's had progressed, as was inevitable, but her family and Dylan remained steadfast in their care and love for her. Despite her moments of confusion becoming more frequent, Margaret's spirit remained intact, and her moments of clarity were treasures they all cherished. Dylan was still working part-time at the Harper estate, balancing his job with his studies and helping his family. Thanks to the Harpers' encouragement and support, he had been able to enroll in a local community college, a step toward his dream of becoming a social worker. One crisp fall morning, Dylan arrived at the Harper house to find Emily sitting on the porch steps, her expression unusually somber. "She's having a hard day," Emily said quietly as Dylan approached. "She didn't recognize me this morning. It's been happening more often lately." Dylan nodded, his chest tightening. He had grown close to Margaret over the past year, and seeing her struggle was never easy. "Do you think she'll want to see me?" he asked. Emily smiled faintly. "If there's one person who can brighten her day, it's you." Inside, Margaret was sitting in her favorite armchair, staring out the window at the garden she had once tended so lovingly. Dylan approached slowly, kneeling beside her. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," he said gently. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, there was no recognition, and Dylan's heart ached. Then her expression softened, and a flicker of memory returned. "Dylan," she said, her voice frail but warm. "My garden boy." He smiled, relief washing over him. "That's right. How are you feeling today?" Margaret reached out and patted his hand. "A little lost, but it's nice to see you. Did you bring the roses back to life yet?" Dylan chuckled, though his throat felt tight. "They're doing great. I even planted some new ones. You'll love them." They spent the morning together in the garden, Margaret directing Dylan as he pruned and watered. Though her mind wandered and she sometimes forgot what they were doing, she seemed happy, her laughter ringing out like music. Later, as Dylan helped her back inside, Matthew pulled him aside. "We've been talking as a family," Matthew said. "We know how much Margaret loves having you here, and frankly we don't know what we'd do without you. So we would love to officially add you to her care team." Dylan blinked in surprise. "Care team?" Matthew nodded. "You've been more than an employee to us, Dylan. You've been family. We want you to have the resources and support you need to keep making a difference for her, and for yourself." It was a lot to take in, but Dylan felt deeply honored. Margaret had given him so much, and he was grateful for the chance to give back in whatever way he could. As the months went on, Margaret's condition continued to decline, but her bond with Dylan never faltered. On her hardest days, he was a calming presence, reading her favorite poetry or playing her beloved classical music. On her better days, they laughed and reminisced, creating new memories even as old ones slipped away. One particularly poignant afternoon, Margaret had a rare moment of clarity. She took Dylan's hand and said, "You've made my days brighter, dear boy. I might forget many things, but I'll never forget what you've done for me." Tears stung Dylan's eyes, but he managed to smile. "I'll always be here for you, Mrs. Harper." When Margaret passed away peacefully a few months later, Dylan was heartbroken, but he found solace in knowing he had made her last year one filled with love and connection. The Harpers, in turn, wrapped him in their arms, reaffirming that he would always be part of their family. At the memorial service, Emily approached Dylan with a small, carefully wrapped box. "Grandma wanted you to have this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with a single word, hope. "She always said you were her hope," Emily explained. And ours too. As Dylan slipped the bracelet onto his wrist, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond words. Margaret had shown him the profound power of kindness, and he vowed to carry that lesson forward, honoring her memory in every act of compassion he could offer. Though she was gone, Margaret's legacy lived on, not just in the foundation her family had established in her honor, but in the countless lives she had touched, including Dylan's. The bonds they had built were unbreakable, reminding Dylan that even in the face of loss, love and kindness could endure.